Hi everyone. So this video is about narrative structure. So I'm basically going to cover the basis of what a narrative structure is and different kinds of narrative structures that you can use in your writing or scripting, like in your screenwriting and stuff. So for your filmmaking. So what is a narrative structure? So it is a literary element used to describe the structural framework that underlies the order or the manner of how the story is presented to the reader, listener, or viewer. So the main narrative structures that are necessary are the plot and the setting. So stories are about conveying the key conflicts, main characters, settings, and events. And is also used for dramatic action being told in a chronological order, or some stories are not even told in chronological order, which I'm going to tell you in a presentation. And plot is about asking questions about the key stages of the conflict and how it is resolved. So here's a diagram that shows about structuring a narrative. And the beginning part is basically the exposition or setting the scene. So basically, you set the scene called main characters. Who are your main characters? Where are they? And what's the genre or the theme of the story? Which is meant to be throughout the story, meant to be portrayed throughout the story, basically. And then you get the problem and the writing action that happens with the problem. Whether the problem gets better or gets worse, or if the new problem develops. The climax is basically the middle part of the story. Some people say it's the end, and I think it's the end mostly, which is how the problem gets solved, and sometimes it doesn't get solved, and there's new problems that come with it, or maybe the character doesn't realize that they're the actual problem, or their behavior is the problem, or the way they see things is the problem. And there's the falling action. Maybe there's like a fight scene, or some people, or maybe a character gets arrested or something that comes with a resolution or denouement is basically the end and or how it gets resolved. There's one called the Freitag pyramid. I think that's what this is basically. I think that's how the Freitag pyramid does it because it does it in 5 stages, not the typical ones that I'm going to show you. Like there's different variations, like the 3-act structure. I've already made a video about that, but I'm not going to talk about it too much. So there's a model that's used to show the main parts of the story, which is divided into 3 acts. So basically, Act 1 is known as the setup, Act 2 is the confrontation, Act 3 is the resolution. Sorry. And I've already explained it was developed by Elias Donatis, and again by Sitfield, who brought it up in his 1979 book, Screenplay: The Foundations of Screenwriting. I've never read the book, but I know about the book, so and you can learn from that. So it's used for classical storytelling in filmmaking or any other forms of storytelling associated with the West. It's normally in Hollywood films as well, which you mostly see nowadays when you watch a lot of old movies like in the 1920s or 30s, even in the 1940s, like it has this same structure all the time. No matter what the storyline is or what the genre is, it's always the same. And here's a diagram of the 3-act structure. I'm not even going to go through because I've already made a video about it. I might link it in the description if you want to look at that. So I hope I get this right. Kishoten Kesu, which is the main story structure found in classical Chinese, Japanese, and Korean narratives. So unlike the three act structure, which we all came to come to know, it is divided into four sections which can be defined and used differently from each of the three cultures where the form is most commonly found. So section one is the introduction, so introducing the story, which the three actor structure does, and section two is the developmental stages of the story. So how the story comes, or how the story forms in within itself, and the turning point, basically, which is the reveal or the plot twist, and section four is the conclusion or the resolution or climax of the story. So the fact that this doesn't really have a conflict, which is really strange, really, but maybe the conflict comes in the second part of the story. It's in the middle, but it's not necessarily. It normally happens in the second, and they saying that the conflict is developing into a plot twist. I think that's what this is. And it's split into parts like key is the intro. The word is split into four sections, and that's how the word comes together. The key is the introduction, sha is the development, ten is the twist, ketsu, which is the conclusion. So categories. So linear narrative, which is when a story is told in chronological order as it happens. So the story is basically one single line and it doesn't break from that. It's normally seen in classical film structures in mainstream Hollywood films. And a good example of this is a very good film called Citizen Kane, which is made by Orson Welles, where the story about his life is told in flashbacks, starting with his childhood. But some people think flashbacks are associated with non-narrative structures. But it's not really true because it depends how the flashback is used in some cases. And you can see that it's very obvious from the time where his childhood happens to the end, if you have seen the film before. And usually in films, stories proceed to put the ending at the beginning of the film. Sometimes it does change the way that it's ordered, but you can follow through with it because you know what's happened and you know it's obvious basically that his life at the end woves with the beginning. So it doesn't need to use it's obvious. Sometimes they put the ending at the beginning of the film, then the flashback appears to show the beginning of the story of his life basically. So using a non-linear narrative allows the reader to understand the events in which in the correct order they have taken place. So there's a line to the beginning and the end of the line. And the event is happening in the beginning. And exposition normally happens in the beginning as well. And you can see how much of a line this story is. And the story begins in a line. And some stories are interwoven, but they don't. This is a very simple version of it. I have a link for that, diagrams of how stories are structured, in using different shapes and stuff. So till the story begins and then the story node comes. And then you have more story nodes, but they come back within each other. Or they stay parallel, separate until the end. Or till the conflict happens. And a non-linear narrative could also be known as disjointed or disrupted narratives. So they are stories which portray events in non-chronological order and does not follow the traditional format like a linear narrative does. So Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino is a film which follows this structure, and it's basically with three short stories with close inspection are broken up into three parts in one story. So he chooses to structure his stories like this, Tarantino. He often uses these complex narratives in his stories and screenwriting as well. And the way he says he has it's quite complicated to understand, but I heard a video or podcast about how he does it. So it's more complicated than it sounds. So Tarantino chooses to structure this story without using a flashback to portray past events or portray the characters' lives. But they do connect because some of it, the because sometimes there's more than one structure in this film. Maybe that's why people find Pulp Fiction difficult to understand, which I'm going to go through shortly. And this structure is clearly common in independent or art house films, which do not have a clear narrative structure. And you see here that it does interwove, unlike the linear narrative, which doesn't do that. So that's why stories are very difficult to understand. And here's the same down here. Like the problem happens, the start of the story happens, there's a problem and there's another problem. And then these problems become struggles. And sometimes the struggles become worse and they interwove into a new problem. And they do have closure towards the end. Some of it depends because they do interwove, like I said before. So, and this circular narrative is where stories end. The story ends as it began. So, although the starting and the ending points are the same, the characters undergo a transformation within themselves or who they are, and maybe they search for their destiny. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but that's how it works. So if it's affected by the story's events that the character goes through a certain kind of transformation. And in films, the story is connected like a loop, which is basically what it is, basically. And David Lynch films are the best example of circular narratives or non-linear, let's say, because he does experiment with different stories, particularly what he does with the film The Lost Highway. And the director crafted his own style of filmmaking with complex narratives, with critics and scholars often referring to his work as Lynchian, basically. And here are other examples on here on the IMDb website, which I'm going to click now. I hope it works. So you see, there's a list here. I'm sorry, this is a bit slow. So you can see, I said The Lost Highway. I've seen a bit of it. It's a bit confusing. I find it very confusing actually. And I'm like, what the hell has happened? Because I was so baffled by what was going on in the film that I didn't really know what happened. Because I've only seen a bit of it, so I didn't really see all of it. And it does get confusing after a while. It gets confusing quite quickly, I guess. I don't know, I haven't seen the beginning, I've only seen kind of the middle towards the end. Then there's the film Triangle, I'm not sure. There's a few other examples here. And 12 Monkeys, which is the one with Bruce Willis and Brad Pitt in it. But I haven't seen it, but I've seen clips of it. So on YouTube, and there's another film that I'm not familiar with, Time Crimes. If you've seen any of those films, what do you think? You know, and back here, now there is different stories. You can see the start points at the top, the very beginning, and it goes round like a circle, like an endless cycle. But sometimes they interwove, which kind of complicates the narrative. You've put one arrow from that story node to another one. Like towards the end, it does get confusing. Like if you make it look like a web or something, it does become a confusing story. I think that's what happens with some films, that they confuse us. And we tend to not know what they're trying to say. I think that's what happens in Pulp Fiction as well, because they interwove everything. And it does become confusing. Sometimes they're parallel, sometimes they're not. It does get complicated. And same with, there's Act 3 and Act 1 are interwoven with Act 2. But most of Act 2 happens in the middle, or towards the middle. And the ending, the resurrection. Sometimes it goes one way, it goes the other way. Sometimes it goes anti-clockwise, and sometimes it goes clockwise. It gets so freaking confusing. So a parallel structure refers to stories with parallel plots, which the writer uses more two or more stories which appear to have separate narratives, but they eventually are connected. So let's say these stories are connected through with a common theme, character, or event. So basically, these characters could be related to each other or something. Like two characters are living their separate lives, but they actually are related to each other, like they're sisters or brothers or something, or cousins, etc. Or they could be common theme, so they could be connected through grief or a new beginning, or an event like could be a tragic car crash or something to do with going to the same university or same college or school, or they haven't seen each other in ages, so they decide to catch up, or they're going on a date. There's lots of stories that have parallel narratives in them. You'd be surprised. And you come up with so many narratives with it. You can play around with it with parallel narratives. And it makes it more interesting as well. So, parallel stories enrich a narrative and has been used for centuries by playwrights and novelists. A simple but effective example used is Finding Nemo. was used in Finding Nemo. So in Finding Nemo, so basically two characters. You know the story of Finding Nemo. There's no point in me telling you. So, and everybody, almost everyone in the whole world has seen Finding Nemo, I guess. So, and there's a list of examples that show different films using parallel stories. I think there's a recent one called Parallel Mothers. I think it's a Spanish film, but I've never seen it. But I think it's must have a parallel narrative to it because two women have different lives, but they are connected in some way. I think that's what it is. I'm guessing that's what the film's about. So I've heard of it, but I've not seen it. But I've seen the trailer, so it kind of does look like it. So here are some other examples, like Young Lions, American Graffiti, which is a famous film by George Lucas before he directed Star Wars. I know a few of my friends are huge fans of Star Wars, which is quite a complicated narrative in itself, but it's very interesting. So now I'm engaged quite easily with it. So there's Nashville, Grand Canyon. Sorry, there's quite a lot. Pulp Fiction there. See, I think that's why people find it difficult to understand it because it has more than one narrative structure, as I disclosed earlier. So, and there's loads. Magnolia, which is a famous Hollywood film. I think it's an indie production, but it's a Hollywood film. So you can see there's a list. I'm going through. I'm not going through everything. Love Actually. I never thought Love Actually would have that kind of narrative in it. But I think yes, if you get the story of Love Actually, each character has their own narrative, and they do come together in some ways or another. So Nine Lives, Sin City, Babel, which is a film. I think it has different people directing this film. It's more than one director, I think. And there's loads of films here. Look how many there are. I don't know how long I'm gonna go through this for. There's loads. It was only 44. Okay. So you can see there's loads here. So you can go on Amazon Prime watch or try and find a film that you really want to watch on here. So here we have these. It does beginning and the event that happens, which causes those characters to interconnect with each other. And the same with the bottom one's the best example actually, with character A, B, and C being connected, living separate lives, but they actually are quite linked with each other. So character A could be a nurse working at a hospital. Character B could be a character B could be a shopkeeper selling goods or some a shopkeeper, and the character C could be a rich businessman, and they're all connected by one thing. And interactive narratives, so they're quite new in terms of how they are done. And they are stories which compose branching narrative structures, meaning a single starting point could lead to multiple developments or outcomes. So, the principle of all such games is that each step of the narrative, video games use this type of interactive narrative, and each step of the narrative, the user makes choices that advance a story together, leading to new series of choices. So, when I was younger, I used to play this game called Sims. I think Sims is very popular now. I like the game. I used to love that game. My sister got me into it, and I enjoyed the game because you get to choose your own character, how they look, how they dress, if they're male, female, or how they interact with the world around them and where they live and all those things, and who they talk to, or who they could be nasty or nice to, all those things. And Bandersnatch, the Netflix film made for on behalf of Black Mirror. It's part of the Black Mirror thing series, I think. But it's a film, which is a great example of an interactive narrative plot where viewers can choose how the events pan out for the protagonist. I've watched the film like twice, and it was like I watched it a couple of years ago actually, and it's very interesting how it's done and the manner it's done, and you get to choose what the character does. So basically, here's the film on the top. So decides, so he chooses whether he could accept the job or refuse the job. And then you see how the story works if he does these things. And here's a roadmap of an interactive narrative. So the exposition happens in the beginning, we all know that. So the decision point is where the stars are. The stars represent the key as the decision point. So whether they grab a soda or grab a beer, and then there's the main story. The main story says join inappropriate photo or decline it. And then you see what happens. Let's say I declined that. Then here's about others who ended up in trouble. So that's what happens if you decline it. If I decide to decline, so I hear about people getting into trouble or join the inappropriate narrative photo and get reprimanded by the dean of students. So the dean's like basically the head of house, I think. I think that's what the dean is. I don't think I ever had a dean when I was in, we had a head of year department in my school, or head of year in my school, so yeah. Or we have, but when I was in college, we had a head of department because I left school quite soon, so. And here are the references for the that I used for the websites. I think the third reference is very important because it shows different diagrams here and there. So you can see these story nodes. And I've used some of these images to say simple branching for the linear narrative. There's diamond branching, which sometimes it goes round, but then it leads back to where it leads to the next part. And there's the petal one, which kind of looks complex, but it's not that complicated. And non-linear narratives, there's so much going on. It does make you feel so damn confused. And same here. This one gets even confusing. Sometimes and they just added guest and story here. Sometimes they add another character in the middle of the story, which kind of puts the story flips the story over, it does make it seem confusing. Because if you add more things, it depends how you add them or what you do with it, and it makes it so damn confusing. And I maybe that's why I don't really get some films, because some films either add something else, another theme, or another object or character or something, and this story failed, which I didn't even go through. It's basically this four diagram, four square diagram, how this end and the start point start. And there's all these diagrams here. I saw another one. There's one here. It's the same diagram, but I think they added different coloured squares. There's a circular narrative which I've gone through. And I did say before that they do interwove, and sometimes it does get complicated, especially if they add new arrows, like if they go round, or sometimes it goes round, but the main round here, and sometimes this part, it does get complicated, and it really bugs me. So I think this is the video. I'm gonna end it here. So thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye.